Okay. All right. Hello, folks. Welcome. We're going to get started here in a little bit. Good to see everybody. Got a lot to go through, so I'm not going to wait too long, but we'll give people a couple of minutes. Keep advancing when I don't mean to. Welcome everybody who's just coming in the room. To my colleagues here, does anything say that we're recording? Because I thought it started, but can you tell? Okay, I can see that it is. Sorry about that. Okay, it's 7:02. Gonna give people just another couple seconds here and see what we got. Still pouring in the door. All right, well, I'm gonna go ahead and get started. Like I say, we have a lot to go through. Welcome everybody again. My name's Dave Sly. I'm Conservation Director for Wild Virginia. We are co-hosting this event with Potomac Riverkeeper Network. Very happy to be partnered with them. And so you're going to be hearing a lot from me, probably more than you ever wanted to, but you're also going to be hearing from some interesting people. David Flores is here from Potomac Riverkeeper Network. He's going to speak to you a little bit later. Jackie Goodrum, who works with me at Wild Virginia, is going to join in. And I wanted to recognize Kate Rasmussen, who's an intern here for Wild Virginia, and also Quintessa Gaines, who is our fellow for this school year. So very proud of all these folks. And let's get rolling here. Now, this program is being recorded, just so you know. If you would like, introduce yourself in chat. We like to see who's here. If you want to say something about where you're coming from or anything like that, that'd be great. During the program, go ahead and put questions in the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to as many of those later as we can. Know that while a lot is passing by you, you don't have to take tons of notes. You don't have to try to keep up with everything, because we're going to send you a follow-up link or a follow-up email with a link to the video, the PowerPoints, and some other useful things. So we're not going to leave you high and dry at the end of this. And finally, a little bit later, we're going to put a document and a link in the chat box that'll be useful for you, or we hope it will. And now my little commercial for Wild Virginia. We work on PFAS, but we work on a whole range of other things. Wild Virginia is a leader in habitat connectivity in Virginia. We work on a range of water quality issues besides PFAS. Pipelines has been a big part of my life for the last 10 years. And we have this great thing called our Clean Water Advocates Program. So you want to follow us all the time, because we have lots of good programs, lots of online things. And so you need to be a Wild Virginian if you're not already. So you probably saw in the notices that went out that we were going to discuss two separate permits during this session. those two permits. The first one is Fort Belvoir, and it's supposed to cover discharges, stormwater discharges. They're termed industrial stormwater discharges. The other is a wastewater treatment plant for the county of Arlington. Now, you got something in red there because that one's the one that we want to pay the most attention to. There is a public comment period open right now for that Fort Belvoir permit. So it's the one that I'm going to talk mostly about during this presentation. And we're really encouraging you to join us to submit comments and to help make our case there. The Arlington permit we thought was going to be open for public notice by now. It's kind of overdue, but it hadn't happened yet. So kind of stay tuned. What you learn here tonight about the permitting systems and how to comment and that kind of thing will be just as useful then. And maybe you get a little breather between this one and the next one. So we hope you'll pay attention to that one too. You may or may not be an expert on PFAS. I don't claim to be because there's a lot to know. But I thought I would start with just a little bit about the basics of what are they? They are everywhere. They're scary enough. You see a list of things here: nonstick cookware, stain-resistant carpeting, pizza boxes. One that is very pertinent for Fort Belvoir, in fact, is firefighting foam. But there's a range of things. I mean, there's just a lot of them, and they've been around since the 40s, and they have proliferated because we find them useful for a lot of things we do in our lives. Um, but the very properties that make them long lasting and resilient can also be a problem. The fact that we call them forever chemicals because they do not break down easily. And while they're still there, they will accumulate in humans and wildlife, and they'll actually concentrate within our bodies, the bodies of fish. And as you go up that food chain in wildlife, they will also continue to concentrate. Um, Again, another scary thing is that they can be harmful to human health, to wildlife in very, very small amounts. Most people aren't used to talking in terms of parts per trillion, but that's what we're talking about here. And I always mess up the analogy, but I think it's one drop in 10 swimming pools is what people equate um, part per trillion to. That might not be exactly right, but it is on that kind of scale. Um, and at those very low levels, as I say, they're dangerous and they can cause some very serious problems. Again, I'm not going to go through all those. There are a number of kinds of cancer that some of them are considered likely causes of certain cancers. So they're a big deal. They're kind of becoming everywhere. And so what the heck do we do? The fact that is a huge problem. I think that most of us would think, well, we got to stop making these things. We got to stop using them. We got to stop buying them. And I probably agree with all those things. But what we decided to do at Wild Virginia is focus on something we could do right now that is already possible and frankly is already required under the law. And that is to try to keep as many of these chemicals from being added to the environment as we can. Um, as it says here, we've got some specific tools to use, and that's what we're asking you to help us do tonight. Um, and we're finding these things in our drinking water sources. And there's a lot of emphasis on trying to deal with it once it gets there. But it should never be allowed to get there. We keep saying go upstream, which means in a physical sense, go upstream, up the river and find where the sources are. But it also means go back to that discharger and back to that industry that feeds water into that discharger and so on. So you're going up that chain. And if we actually enforce the kind of requirements that should be there for dischargers, people who are releasing it to the environment, then that'll put pressure on those other layers to then try to solve this problem. That practical tool that I'm talking about is called the Virginia Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. It mirrors the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, which is under the Environmental Protection Agency, under the Clean Water Act. Virginia operates a program by delegation from EPA, which means Virginia has to follow all the basic standards of the Clean Water Act. They can go further than the Clean Water Act as far as being more stringent, more protective, but they can't be less so. So when I talk about meeting requirements, meeting legal duties, I'm usually talking about both. Um, those permits, the VPDS permits, do allow discharge of pollutants. Sometimes it's wastewater from municipal sewage treatment plants, from industries. Again, in the case of Fort Belvoir, what it is what is called industrial stormwater. But that carries pollutants to our water bodies, and it also needs to be monitored and controlled. The end effect of this permitting system is that we're supposed to make sure that the streams, the water bodies are actually protected, are kept in the kind of quality that we need, that is useful for humans, that's sustainable as an ecosystem, that supports aquatic life, that does all these things that we depend on water bodies to do. Um, so that's kind of the basics of what the system that we're talking about here. Excuse me. While Virginia, as well as a number of other groups, there are others who've actually been in this longer than we have, but there's been a pretty good coalition of folks looking at some of these permits, issuing comments for at least 2 or 3 years. And that has included some municipal permits, industrial discharges. Um, and it says here likely to contain PFAS. Now that actually is an old part of a slide, because at first the permits that we were commenting on mostly, and it's still the case a lot of times, we didn't have any data to show that there were definitely PFAS in those discharges. But we're gaining more of that. We're coming to more permits where we absolutely know that there's PFAS being released, which makes it even more incumbent on us and on the state regulators to do something about it. But so far, the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality has resisted taking those necessary steps to help us figure out exactly what is being discharged and then to stop harmful things from going out there. Uh, I'm going to give you a little break, turn it over to David Flores and let him talk a little bit about Potomac Riverkeeper Network's program.
Thank you, Dave. So I just wanted to give a bit of an overview and place Potomac Riverkeeper Network in this community of folks focused on PFAS contamination in Virginia and in the larger Mid-Atlantic region. Are just very quickly, Potomac Riverkeeper Network. We're a small but mighty nonprofit advocacy organizations. We have 3 riverkeepers who cover the lower Potomac River, the upper Potomac River, and the Shenandoah River, which is a tributary to the Potomac. And we have organizationally 3 sort of highest tier programmatic priorities. One dealing with citizen enforcement of clean water law. The other dealing with cleaning up the legacy of toxic coal ash contamination. And then our program of work on PFAS contamination in our watershed as well. We're working in Virginia, we're working in Maryland, West Virginia, other parts of the watershed where we've prioritized investigating PFAS contamination and advocacy, principally in three different sources or sectors that are contributing to environmental contamination by PFAS. The first is wastewater treatment plants and other wastewater discharges, which is sort of what we're dealing with here tonight in part. Also with the residual solid waste from conventional wastewater treatment, which is marketed as biosolids and land applied with very few controls on farm fields. So it's contaminating our watersheds through that route. And then lastly, we have I think, a pretty tremendous, remarkable number of Department of Defense installations the entire length of the Potomac River, from the Allegheny Ballistics Laboratory, which is a naval installation way out in Rocket Center, West Virginia, all the way down to another naval installation called Dahlgren, and its Potomac River Test Range. And so we've been working on PFAS contamination for a number of years. Dahlgren, for example, we sued the Navy. They've been discharging munitions, testing munitions here. You can see in the Potomac River, at a pretty large stretch of the river, for almost 100 years. And for as long as we've had the Clean Water Act, which is 50 odd years, I guess, at this point, they've never had a Clean Water Act permit. So we sued the Navy, entered into settlement agreement. The Maryland Department of the Environment is actually developing the permit, even though the installation is located in Virginia, because the river, as some folks might know, actually belongs to Maryland, not Virginia. And then as you can see here, sort of in this other map, we're actively working on permit advocacy dealing with biosolids applications in the northern neck and middle peninsula portion of the state. So happy to answer any questions that folks have about this particular work. Obviously, we're dealing here tonight with a wastewater treatment plant and a DoD installation in the Potomac watershed. So really eager to be working with you all on this. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Again, we greatly value working with Riverkeeper and a lot of the other coalition of groups that are working on this stuff. I told you that we're not going deep into the Arlington wastewater discharge, but since I promised you there was going to be something, I wanted to just give you a little taste of that. And again, maybe entice you to come back when that public notice period actually starts. The map here shows, maybe not that well, the location of that discharge. It discharges the 4 mile run, not far from the mouth where it pours into the Potomac. Many of you may see some of the landmarks there. Potomac Yard is just down a little bit. It's a big plant. It discharges, or is designed to discharge as much as 40 million gallons a day, which is quite a lot. It handles, waste from homes, from businesses, from industries. So it's a complicated mixture of wastewater. And the fact is that these big wastewater plants, even though we think of them as sewage plants a lot of times, if they have industry, they're almost always going to have PFAS from some of those industry. And there are many sources from our homes and other places too. We were happy to find that Arlington County, which owns this plant, had on its own initiative gone and done some sampling for PFAS. We did a Freedom of Information Act request earlier last year, and they quickly provided us with a pretty good body of information. You can see where the gray arrows are on their diagram here. They sampled where the water comes in to the wastewater plant, the influent, the effluent, where it goes out into the stream, and also a stage of treatment for the sludge, or what when it's marketed, as David said, is called biosolids. So they sampled all three of those places, which is good and appropriate. And they found a lot. They looked at a whole big list of types of PFAS. You know, I mentioned earlier that one of the slides mentioned earlier that there are thousands of kinds of PFAS. We're still on the scratching the surface as to what we test for. But Arlington's folks did a really wide range of them. And what they found was that there were at least 15 of them that were at levels that are concerning in their effluent. I will say that we looked at the influent versus the effluent, and they didn't always match up. And that's a complication of this thing in that these things can change in the wastewater. They can change once they get into the stream. Anyhow, the fact that there were 15 types that were detectable was notable. It's also notable, I can't see on my slide because of the picture here. It's also notable that some of the amounts are pretty big, at least compared to drinking water standards and some other standards that we like to look at. The two on top there, PFOA and PFOS, are ones that probably a bigger portion of people have heard about. They are the two that EPA considers likely carcinogens, and they are two that for which drinking water standards have been set. For both of those drinking water standards are set at 4 nanograms per liter. You see at PFOA here at 10.65, PFAS coming close. But what EPA also says is that the target is non-detectable. So 4 still prevents a risk. And we would assert that these things should be non-detectable in the discharge that goes into our waters. Those other 2 chemicals there are also notable. And one of the things that we don't know that much about yet, we're still kind of trying to learn, is what the combination of all these different kinds, what kind of risk those cause. EPA says very clearly that they expect them to have additive effects, but we don't know the nature of that very well. Okay, so I'm done with Arlington. As I say, we're going to try to get you interested in that again a little bit later, but let's move on quickly to Fort Belvoir. Again, there's the location. You see that there are 2 parts of their property, the north area and the main post. Accotink Creek is one that's particularly interesting because it starts up where that north area is. It runs through that area and then runs down through and along the main area as well. It has a number of unnamed tributaries. Mason Run is one of the tributaries. And then there are other water bodies, Dogue Creek, Dunstan Cove, that are or can be affected by the military installation. And then the thing is that once these PFAS, if they get into any of those upstream areas, as I said before, they're going downstream. They don't go away quickly. Sometimes they will bind to sediments, get taken up by wildlife, but they can have effect for many miles. In fact, even DEQ has now admitted that when they're looking for sources of contamination for certain drinking water intakes or supplies, that they believe they have to go all the way to the head of whatever watershed they're looking at. And we agree with that. So again, here we have data because the Army, through a national program and through their own initiative at Fort Belvoir, went and looked. A lot of these installations know that there's a history of use of PFAS. And as I said, one reason for that is that firefighting foam has been used at a lot of these places. There are probably other sources, but anyway, it is known that a lot of PFAS can show up. David, got your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. I wanted to mention one other way in which DoD installations can cause or contribute to PFAS contamination, and that is through manufacturing, testing, and disposal of munitions, including rockets. So now sometimes it's hard to at a given installation, they may have used firefighting foam historically and also tested rockets, right? And so both of those practices can contribute to contamination of groundwater with PFAS. But there are a number of installations in the Chesapeake Bay watershed in Virginia, in the Potomac watershed, where military munitions are being manufactured, tested, and disposed of through a practice called open burning and open detonation, which kind of like biosolids application to land, pretty uncontrolled way of disposing of a toxic waste product.
Mhm.
So I just wanted to share that. There are a few, I think everything from the NOAA and NASA installations out near Accotink on the eastern shore, as I mentioned before, in the Potomac, all the way up to the Allegheny Ballistics Laboratory in West Virginia. They're testing and manufacturing and disposing of waste munitions.
Thank you. That's helpful. So yeah, as I say, I think it was a national program through which Fort Belvoir contracted to have this study done. Lots of bases, lots of installations around the country are doing the same thing. And frankly, a lot of them have this problem and they know it. So again, we appreciate that we have some information to work with. What it tells us is that at places on the Fort Belvoir property, we do have contamination in surface water, groundwater, and soil, and some of it is fairly shocking. Um, I picked there are a number of different kind of clusters of areas where we saw in the study that there were pollution problems in groundwater, whatever. I picked this one, which is again what they call their north area, in part because this is the only place in the whole property of the two properties where during this study at least they sampled surface waters. And lo and behold, in those surface waters, which happens to be a wetland, it's the one titled FTBL 66, I believe there, had pretty substantial amounts of PFAS. Um, so, you know, what we are concerned with is if we sampled just one and we found that, why aren't we sampling more places? Why isn't DEQ requiring more sampling so that we know the extent of this? And, how are we going to deal with that? Now, at these same sites, both the FTBL 66 and 68, they both sampled groundwater at the same time. And again, found significant numbers. Not huge here, and you'll see huge in a minute, but still concerning because, as we say, we don't believe any of this stuff or any measurable amount of this stuff should be getting in our water bodies. It's not natural. It accumulates in a way that causes it to be dangerous at even those small numbers, those small concentrations. And so our goal should be no detectable amounts in our waters. Now, the significance of the groundwater contamination, that's bad enough as it is. That should be available for drinking and for other things. But in a context like this, one of the real concerns is that groundwater usually moves. It usually goes somewhere. In other words, if it's right next to a stream, as these sources are, there's a very good chance that there's a close tie between that groundwater and those surface waters. Now, whether it is absolutely moving into those specific streams or not, again, we won't know unless we sample, unless we make those connections. Um, but again, clearly with that surface water contamination, and I'll say in the study, essentially it just says there was a firefighting activity or training center up gradient from this site. So there's reason to believe that it probably just ran right off and ended up in that wetland. But in any case, this is just one small cluster. Now, I'll point out that the permit that DEQ is proposing to issue has no attention to this area at all. When they have looked at stormwater discharges, places where pollutants might be leaving the Fort Belvoir properties, they haven't accounted for any up here. And we think that's a problem. So let's move on to this one. And my numbers have gotten kind of skewed here, but so you'll see that this is an airport here. And there, all of those red markers are places where they sampled and found significant amounts of the three kinds of PFAS that they measured. Now, again, I noted that Arlington had measured a whole slew of them. Here they measured only PFOA, PFAS, and PFBS. We would obviously like to see more of them. Those might be the most appropriate ones, but that doesn't mean that we can trust that that's all that's there. But in any case, within a fairly close range here around this airport, we've got 6 separate places that were sampled for groundwater and for soil that have lots of PFAS. Now that yellow marker is what I was talking about, where DEQ has designated an outfall. In other words, a place where stormwater they believe is running off a site and they have to have it monitored and checked where it's going into the nearby stream. But is that enough? Does that cover what all is running off this site? I'm pretty skeptical that that's the case. But in any case, look at those groundwater numbers. With PFOA, we ranged all the way from 3 nanograms per liter up to 52,000. Pretty eye-popping. Again, when you talk about 4 nanograms per liter being a drinking water standard that is a threat for carcinogen or cancer, that's a big deal. Same thing with PFAS, everywhere from 10 to 28,000. PFBS, also pretty huge. So again, we just don't think, well, again, let's go back that DEQ has designated or has acknowledged some specific discharge points where they say stormwater is entering surface waters. And they've only chosen to require any kind of monitoring and requirements for dealing with pollutants at those places. I'll say that in reviewing the records, even EPA has come down to DEQ and said, you're not looking at all the right places. There are outfalls that you should be including in this permit that you haven't. And I'll go further to say that where we have these groundwater problems, where we have heavy soil contamination, there are likely other places where there are discharges of PFAS into our waters. So, and again, look at DEQ's proposed permit. They did designate 7 discharge points. As I say, we think there are quite a few more. As has been their practice for 3+ years now, while people have been insisting that we need monitoring, we need to have prohibitions on discharge of PFAS, they are simply refusing to do that. This is, if you haven't looked at discharge permits, this image here is what they call a limitations page, and it spells out the pollutants that they want to pay attention to, the ones that they're going to require you to do some monitoring for, and sometimes ones where they place limitations on how much of those pollutants can be in your discharge. Whoops, sorry. You know, pH, total suspended solids, hydrocarbons, chloride. Surely, can be important for water quality, but kind of pale in comparison to these horrible forever chemicals that we know the danger of. And so they're willing to include those kinds of parameters, which they should, but they're just insistently saying we're not going to do PFAS. So therefore, we certainly believe that the permit that has been drafted, that's been proposed, is not legally sufficient. As I say, it's supposed to live up to the Clean Water Act and state law, the state water control law. And we certainly believe that it does not do either of those things. Specifically, when there is going to be a discharge from a point source, which some of these stormwater discharge points certainly qualify. And if there are pollutants there that are going to go out into our water bodies, DEQ actually has a duty to account for those. First of all, the applicant is supposed to disclose them, and then DEQ is supposed to analyze whether and how they should be controlled. And the only way you can do the control properly is if you do sampling and monitoring so you know exactly what's happening. And in these cases, there are a number of things you want to look at in the water body as far as what kind of threats PFAS poses. PFAS damages wildlife, damages everything from waterfowl to amphibians and probably a lot in between. But it also obviously can harm humans, as I was describing. It can do that in a couple ways. It can do it through drinking water, and I've talked about drinking water standards, but it also can do it through ingestion of the flesh of fish and shellfish. EPA has come up with some proposed criteria. One set that deals with what needs to be in streams to be safe for both drinking water and consumption of fish and shellfish. But this area, there are no public drinking water sources or intakes near this. So what we looked at specifically is the set of criteria that are supposed to be protecting our water so that I can go catch a fish whenever I want and eat it out of that stream or out of any of those affected streams and be safe. I will tell you that the proposed criteria for that kind of exposure that EPA came up with is order of magnitudes lower than even the lower samples that I've described here. So we are asking people to join us in making comments. Our comments will say, DEQ, you should not issue this permit as it's drafted, and you should allow us a public hearing so that these issues can be aired even more widely, so that more people know what's going on, so that people can get in a room and exchange what they know. So that's where we're going. I'm going to talk a little bit in a while more about exactly how to go about that, how you can join us in doing that. But now I'm going to turn it over to Jackie, who's going to tell you a little bit about just kind of some general ideas. If you're not used to making public comments, just some good reminders. So take it away, Jackie.
Okay. Hey, everyone. So in addition to my work with WAD Virginia, I also am a university lecturer and I teach a course on effective public commenting. So to start, you want an effective comment is a comment that is clear, concise, and convincing. This means it includes relevant, factual information, sound legal or scientific reasoning, and supporting evidence. And it connects the decision that the agency is making to the impacts that this decision will have on you, your family, or your community. Now, effective comments have the potential to influence environmental decision-making. It's not guaranteed that they will, but by making them clear, concise, and convincing, hopefully they'll be able to persuade the decision maker to agree with you. So next slide. So make your comment clear. So the agency will be reading hundreds or thousands of comments on this issue, and you want your comment to stick out by making it clear. The end result of a poorly written comment is that the person responsible for revising the permit is unlikely to make important changes because of the way the comment was written. So before you get started writing, you actually want to sit and think about what you're going to say. Gather all the necessary information and facts. We're giving a lot of that to you tonight through this webinar. When you're writing, use an organized format, use ordered lists if that makes sense, and keep it to that neat and tidy, like think 5-paragraph essay from school. Your comment needs to look good and read well. The readability helps it be more persuasive and be clear, and the content matters. You want it to be relevant, providing information that the agency doesn't already have. Your tone matters, your style matters, but organization matters, I think, most of all. Next slide. Make your comment concise. This is going to be short, but not too short. It's going to be more than one sentence or a paragraph. If you don't have a lot to say, aim for about 1 page or about 5 paragraphs of writing. Use only as many words as is necessary. There's no need to keep going on and reiterating the point or like I'm doing, being too verbose. Avoid run-on sentences. Avoid dense paragraphs of text. You want that comment to be able to read well, so use some spacing between if you need to, even if it puts you over onto another page. Next slide. All right, and finally, make your comment convincing. Effective comments are convincing, meaning that they are persuasive. So when you start out writing your comment in your introduction, assert your authority to comment. Tell them who you are and why you are commenting and why you have the authority to speak on this issue. We'll talk a bit more about what that means in a minute, but maybe it's that you have personal experience with this water body or with this area, or maybe you have professional experience with this particular issue. Use relevant facts, use examples, and use data and numbers if you have them. If you have photos even of the affected water bodies, that's also great to include, but I recommend putting it in as like an attachment or an appendix at the end and not taking up space in the body of your comment to insert those things. Use because statements, writing a sentence where you're providing a reason and linking the facts and supporting evidence for that reason with the word because makes it a really powerful statement and a sentence to read. Show, don't tell, use imagery, use word pictures. Don't just tell the agency that this is a bad decision and that PFAS are dangerous, that you fish in this water body, you love to go fishing in this creek or on the Potomac, and that you're worried about how that's going to impact you. Use words to show them, to create pictures in their mind of how this decision is going to impact you. And finally, this is really important, avoid personal insults. Refrain from making any attacks on the decision maker, on the agency, even if you disagree with them, even if you disagree with the state or federal administration. This is not the time for that sort of language, and sorts of words. You're not going to change somebody's mind or persuade them to make a change based on what you said if you're calling them names, and you're going to fail to be heard. And that's not a convincing comment. Now, insults are distinct from critique and criticism. Highlighting the errors that an agency has made, like we're doing here, where we're discussing that this draft permit does not include anything about PFAS, that's an error, that's a legit criticism, and that's something that should be pointed out. So highlighting these errors or omissions and reminding the agency of their legal duties is totally appropriate, but please, no personal attacks. Next slide. Here are just some examples as you're crafting your comment about what sort of facts you would maybe want to include to make your comment persuasive, to make it clear, concise, and convincing. So if you are a landowner nearby or a member of the community, or you're someone who uses these water bodies for fun and enjoyment, you like to recreate, you like to go boating or swimming or fishing, then here are some helpful facts that you could include. The number of years of experience that you've had with this impacted land, water, or wildlife. Any specific impacts that are likely to result from this action that the agency is doing or their lack of action. If they're not taking action on PFAS, then that's going to result in more polluted waterways, more fish with PFAS in them, etc. Finally, also why this land or water or wildlife is special to you and deserves to be protected from environmental harm. If you are a scientist or a subject matter expert, you would want to include your professional credentials and your area of expertise, especially if it relates to environmental science, chemistry, or anything relating to PFAS and water. You want to include the number of years of experience, any professional connection that you might have to the impacted land, water, or wildlife. Maybe you do research on species that live in the Chesapeake Bay or in the Potomac River watershed that could be impacted by PFAS. Anything like that would be relevant and important to include. And finally, if you are a professional or subject matter expert, any opinion that you are able to offer on the agency's action or the analysis that has been performed is also valuable and helps make your comment an effective comment. And those are all the tips and tricks that I have for writing.
Thanks, Jackie. And I will say, some of you may think, you've done it 1,000 times and that might be, feel, oh, I knew all that. But I can't tell you how many people I've seen who are really smart, really educated, really expert, who don't think about some of the nuts and bolts of how to make sure they get heard. So we want you to join us in making comments. As I say, while Virginia, other groups are going to make comments. One of the things that can help do some of the things that Jackie mentioned, like, what are you thinking about how you're going to proceed, how you're going to order your things, and how are you going to bring out, your expertise, for example. There are some guidelines in our regulations that talk about what you need to present if you're going to ask for a public hearing. And again, we want people to say this permit shouldn't go forward as it is, but we also are encouraging people to ask for a public hearing here. The thing is that the regulations say that you need to get 25 or more people to ask for that hearing to bring it up to a threshold of significant public interest. And we think we can meet that goal, but we really need your help. Now, when you write your comments, it doesn't need to be in a separate letter, although it can be. It can be in the body of the email. It can be in a lot of different forms. Again, as long as it's accessible and readable. When you get there, you are going to be addressing this permit with kind of that wording. Those rules as to what you need to include when you're asking for a public hearing are here. Basics, email, phone number, name, the reason for the request, factual nature, and the extent of your interest, and then basically what's wrong with the permit and how to fix it. And I'm just going to quickly kind of walk through some of that. The expression, the reason for why you want it, is kind of spelled out in this quote. Again, it's talking about your interest, and your interests are defined as to why do I care about this stream? Why do I depend on it? How do I use it? All those kinds of things. And so they're talking here about interest, what would be directly adversely affected. Now, the one thing that's difficult here is the extent of such interest and effects. Quantifying some of those things are not easy. But again, if you can say, hey, I really depend on this place, I really need this place to be kept in good shape, that's an expression of strong interest. And I will say that I'm going to run through these quick because we're going to give you a template here in the chat just a minute that kind of spells through some of this. And this just repeats some of what Jackie said. It's just a way to approach and some examples of how you might express your interest. You may have things that I've never dreamed of as to reasons why these water bodies are important to you, and they matter. you know, again, we think the reason why this permit shouldn't be approved is that it doesn't address PFAS, forms of PFAS in the way it's supposed to, in the way it needs to protect our waters. And that if it does not do that, then it's going to affect everybody's interest who depends on these areas. Some of the facts I've tried to explain earlier, and again, we're going to lay some of those out there, but it really just boils down to, we know there's contamination at these sites. We know that at least one surface water has already been measured to be contaminated. We know groundwater and surface water runoff where there's bad soils can cause these problems. And those things can end up violating our water quality standards. Again, I know that's way too many words to put on a slide. So again, here are the basic asks. You know, what do we want? What's wrong and how to fix it? Fairly simple. The permit does not include the things it needs to have, and it can be amended by adding those things, by adding monitoring requirements and proper limitations. So again, when you're making your comments in this instance, I recommend you start off at the very beginning saying, I oppose issuance of the permit, or I urge you not to issue the permit in this form, something like that. And at the same time, I request a public hearing be held. And I'll say that those two are combined. You see that quote there that the regs say that you can ask for a hearing if you're contesting an action or the terms and conditions of a permit. So if you said, I want a hearing, but you didn't present the fact that you don't approve of the permit, or you don't want the permit to go forward, you may not be meeting that requirement. So hopefully about now, there's a Word document in your chat that you can grab and you feel free to use as a template, as a guide to work on your own comments. There's also a link where you can go online and download that, or you can share that link with other folks to do the same thing. And when we send our follow-up email, you'll get those resources as well. Now I'm going to say, we don't expect anybody to just take some form that we make and you know, just blindly fill it out. We want you to express your own viewpoints. I will say that some parts of that, the factual kind of basis, really mirrors what you just heard. And so I feel like that if you understood that, if you can grasp those kinds of facts, then you can agree with the factual basis and kind of the legal basis. So again, that's who you're gonna send comments to. They did include 2 email numbers. Frankly, when they do that, I send it to both, just in case there's a problem with one or the other. And don't forget, next Monday, 11:59 is it. And unlike something I've done, don't wait till 11:57 because it might not work. Okay. We're gonna follow up. We're gonna give you all this kind of stuff. If you miss things, let us know. My email, if you are willing, if you submit comments and you're willing to share them with me by email, I'd be glad to see them. It always helps to see what other people are doing. And if possible, unless I get too many requests, I'll try to answer questions or give you some advice if you need it. So now let's open it up for questions. And I think both Kate and Quintessa, Kate, what do we got in the Q&A box? Anything that we need to address?
Let me look. Someone asked, they said, I'm in a neighboring watershed to Accotink, so not sure about personal stake that would rise to their level of justifying my interest. Is it relevant to say something like, I'm concerned about the precedent this makes for other applicants in future in other watersheds?
Yes. First of all, I tell people, you don't have to live there, you don't have to use those specific waters, but the Potomac River, I don't spend time on the Potomac River, but it's important to me. It's an important water body. It's an historic and rich resource. Um, but that other issue of, do I care about DEQ, carrying out their legal responsibilities? Yes, I do. Because if they don't do it here, then the next one that is in my backyard, they may fail in the same way. David, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think so you might not live in the immediate watershed where this Fort Belvoir or the Arlington County wastewater treatment plant are located. But if you consume seafood, Virginia seafood, you have an interest, a personal interest. And I would say, with maybe within some reasonable limits, if you have friends and family who have direct interests of their own, that might not be too attenuated to discuss how you have friends that live downstream of, say, Fort Belvoir, and you're concerned about their drinking water well becoming contaminated and the risk of disease from that, for instance. So, and I think also, interests in terms of the economic health, right, and welfare of the state are worth discussing as well.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else, Kate?
Someone else asked, is there anything additional that we can do to put pressure on legislation to address PFAS pollution? Would calling our senators be effective?
When we get, well, of course, there's the federal and the state levels, of course, so you have to look at both of those. On the state level, of course, our General Assembly, the last 2 years, they have addressed PFAS in various bills. I'll say, following groups like ours, we're very much involved in that kind of situation. So following us, you get guides, you get information throughout the state legislative session as to how to have an effect. Um, Congress is a whole other can of beans. And yes, talking to your legislators is always important. But it always is good too to understand the context of what is actually being proposed or not proposed at the time. I'm going to see, Quintessa, is there anything that you've seen that you wanted to highlight?
Yes, there's two comments actually. So one is asking that some other advice I've gotten is to say something like, when I visit this area, I'll be exposing myself, children, and family, which would technically be true even if you don't visit the area regularly. Does that sound okay?
Well, I think Dave's hand shot up really quick. I'm gonna defer to you real quick here, and
Well,
then I'll come back if
yeah,
need.
don't defer to me. I mean, I think, if you have an interest in utilizing a particular waterway or being in a certain area and your knowledge that there's PFAS contamination might prevent you or dissuade you from doing so, definitely discuss that. Absolutely discuss that. Um, and uh, yeah, skin contact, my inexpert understanding is that there that there that there actually can be exposure to PFAS through skin contact, and so I've spoken with others who conduct water quality sampling work, and there's real concern about entering into water bodies that are highly contaminated with PFAS to do that field work. I don't know more than that. Um, to suggest that the levels here are so high that would be a real concern. But I think again, if it's a concern that might prevent you from utilizing a waterway or an area that you would otherwise use,
Yeah.
that's absolutely something worth discussing.
And Jackie,
Yes, similarly, I echo what David was saying with if you visited this place in the past and you want to visit in the future, but you're concerned about the risk of contamination, that's totally something to mention and bring up.
yeah, I'll mention that the regulations, the water quality standards say if pollution would interfere with uses. And if I have a perception, if I have a concern with some validity that pollutants are going to be harmful, that's interfering with my right, frankly, to use those water bodies. I'm going to ask Quintessa one more, And we're getting really short on time, but we can run over a minute or two here. So what else you got, Quintessa?
Those were the only two questions that were unanswered,
Okay.
was
Okay.
the skin contact and the one
Right.
asking if the question had been okay.
Peggy's iPad has a great question that connects to the earlier question about engaging lawmakers in the legislative process. Yes, absolutely. I think that's a great practice in doing this sort of permit advocacy is to share your comment with elected leaders, either where the facility is located and then especially if you live in the same jurisdiction, you're one of their constituents. Hearing from the constituents obviously is in significant part, maybe not as much as we would like, how lawmakers decide what they're going to prioritize in their lawmaking. And this is important. So yeah, important practice of permit advocacy is letting elected leaders know about when these permits come up for renewal and what our concerns are individually and collectively.
Well, and also, aside from their legislative duties, if they express opinions on behalf of the folks they represent to the regulators, that carries a lot of weight. In fact, I had communications with a state legislator yesterday who was asking me for some of the facts around this issue. And I asked that person, would you please let DEQ know that they should have a public hearing? And if they do so, that would be great. So it never hurts. Um, so, final word, follow Wild Virginia on the web, follow Potomac River Keeper Network. We keep you up to date with a lot of things that are going on. So go to wildvirginia.org, join us, support us. Look for the follow-up and please submit comments and please ask for that public hearing. These issues, they just haven't been we've tried all the pressure we could, but those public hearings would allow even more attention, even more airing of what's going on. We want all your neighbors and all your friends to know about it too, because this isn't going away. So I'm going to leave it with that. I'm going to thank everybody so much for being here and wish you good night.